Welcome to the second of our 4 lectures. Last week we did the lecture on the Dighton Rock, and tonight we're going to talk about the history of Fall River Mills. Of course, Fall River was the spindle city. It produced more cotton print cloth than any other city in the United States, and it was what made Fall River, really. And this evening, Al Lemer and Mark will be doing a presentation on the beginning of that. This is really the 200th anniversary, the beginning of the textile industry in Fall River, really. I will tell you that next week we will have a talk by Rory Raven, who's going to do a talk on the Sarah Cornell murder, which occurred back in the 1800s, and it's as fascinating, and in some cases maybe more so, than the Lizzie Borden murder, and I think you'll enjoy that as well. And 2 weeks from tonight, Dr. Phil Sylvia will tell us about the baseball and the beginnings of baseball in the city of Fall River. So without much further delay, let me turn this over to Al Lemer and Mark Belanger.
So the introduction, basically we're going to cover the early period of Fall River's history from about 1813 to 1850. 1813 is significant because it's the first 2 mills along the Quequechan River. 1850 is sort of a random cutoff point. 1854, of course, Fall River became a city, and then after the Civil War, we kind of grew real quickly. So it's sort of a random cutoff point, but it kind of contains it. There's a lot of information beyond that, and not so much before that. So we try to focus on that period. As we said. Again, 2013 marks the 200th anniversary of the first 2 cotton mills along the Quequechan River. Unlike that little mill in Tiverton, built 2 years before, the Troy and the Fall River mills proved to be a lasting success and led to further growth in the decades that followed. The early success of Fall River as a textile center is often attributed to its unique combination of reliable water power and a natural harbor, as well as an ideal geographic location between Rhode Island and New Bedford, and later Boston and New York. It also benefited from the ingenuity and determination of its Yankee founders, who in a generation rose from the ranks of simple farmers to wealthy and influential figures. And much is known, as much has been said about the period during the late 19th and early 20th century, when Fall River was the largest textile center in the Western Hemisphere. In 1900, we were the 33rd largest city in the United States. At its peak around 1924, we had a population of over 130,000, with many thousand employed in over 150 mills containing over 4 million spindles and 91,000 looms, which, if you know anything about, these are just mind-boggling figures for any city in the United States. Specialization was common in many cities during this period, and Fall River was no different. We concentrated almost exclusively, on a single product, printed cotton cloth, otherwise known as print cloth. And then while there's a decent amount of information on the early period in Fall River's history leading up to about 1850, it's usually less descriptive and, of course, lacking photographs and other material evidence. This discussion will attempt to paint a picture of what occurred in Fall River during these early years and how it was able to grow from a small rural village to a notable but still small industrial city by the time of the Civil War. And to just give you an idea of the period that we're talking about, 1810, we had a population of about 1,200 people. This is the whole town of what was then called Troy. Most of those were up in Steep Brook and all that area there. Still by 1820, hadn't grown much. A little bit of growth during the 1820s, a little more than the 40s, the 30s. The 40s kind of grew quite dramatically. By 1850, it was still a small town, 11,000 people, and by 1860, it was 14,000. So, compared to today, it's still a pretty small place. Most of the population grew after 1870, and really, big ways. Now I'm going to turn it over to Al Lima, who's going to give the early introduction of before the industrial period. Excuse me, Al.
Which slide?
Okay. I'll just tell them.
Great, thanks, Mark. I'd like to give you just some context of Fall River before it became an industrial community. And with Mark's introduction, we want to give you some context to tonight's presentation. The development of textile mills didn't just happen in some historical vacuum. The development of textile, they happened as a result of an evolutionary process that began some time ago. For our purposes tonight, human existence can be divided into three main epochs: the hunter-gatherer era, the agricultural era, and the Industrial Revolution. The hunter-gatherer era, which lasted for millions of years, human beings lived by foraging off the land and by killing and eating animals. It was a life frequently on the edge of starvation and often very short. The hunter-gatherer era ended about 10,000 years ago with the introduction of agriculture. In the agricultural era, land began to be cultivated to produce food, and animals were husbanded to produce power and animal products. Agriculture required that humans stay in place. This resulted in the formation of villages and, in many instances, the creation of cities. Civilization, as we now know it, began to evolve and flourish. But about 200 years ago, in what is a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, the industrial era began. The Industrial Revolution produced machines to do the work that animals, wind, and water once did in the previous agricultural era. It resulted in an enormous increase in productivity, wealth, and general well-being. In the agricultural era in Fall River, we can divide it into native tribes, the colonists, and village locations. Fall River mirrored the three stages of evolutionary time. The native tribes that existed here were solely hunter-gatherers until about 1,000 years ago, when agriculture was introduced to this area by way of tribes from other regions. By the time the Pilgrims arrived, the native tribes were still hunter-gatherers to some extent, but were also practicing a primitive form of agriculture using only hand labor. When early English settlers arrived in Fall River, they were also in the agricultural era, although in the later stages of it. And the village surrounding the Quequechan River Falls was an especially good example of it. Farm families in New England, and of course in Fall River, were largely self-sufficient. Virtually all of a family's needs were met through the family's own resourcefulness. Farm families grew their own food, raised their own livestock for meat, milk, butter, cheese, and eggs, made their own clothing on spinning wheels and looms using wool provided by their own sheep, grew apples for the hard cider, made their homes, barns, and tools from lumber provided by their own woodlots, obtained fuel from those same woodlots, and generally provided for themselves. Animals were used to power agricultural implements and to power wagons for freight and stagecoaches for passengers. Wind power was used to propel vessels for marine navigation. Water power had become an important source of power in the later agricultural era. In Fall River, the falls of the Quequechan River powered 3 sawmills, 4 grist mills, 1 fulling mill, and 2 blacksmith shops. All through the agricultural era, population centers grew along the coast or along navigable waterways, since water vessels provided the fastest, easiest, and least costly way of moving goods between towns, cities, and regions. Along the Taunton River, we see the growth of villages along the shoreline, including Fall River, Steep Brook, Assonet, Somerset Village, Dighton, Berkeley, Taunton, and others further upstream. Now, textiles, as just noted, were produced on self-sufficient farms in Fall River, where families made their own clothing produced by home spinning wheels and looms, using wool from their own sheep or flax that they had grown on the farm. Until Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1794, cotton was uneconomic and too time-consuming for farm families to use in home spinning and weaving. After weaving the cloth, it was processed in the fulling mill and bleached in the sun and perhaps printed with blocks. Again, the basic process of spinning and weaving by hand to produce cloth hadn't changed significantly in the 10,000 years from when spinning and weaving were first introduced as a human activity. The drop spindle was used for 9,000 years to spin yarn. The spinning wheel wasn't introduced into Europe until the Middle Ages, about 1000 AD. Next. So, essentially, that's where we find Fall River at the end of the agricultural era and the beginning of the industrial era. There was a period that lasted for 10,000 years. Indeed, the Greeks of antiquity would have felt quite comfortable in the village and would have found it quite familiar. However, all of that was about to change. Mark will now end the suspense and tell us what happened next. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Here's a map in 1812 of Fall River. It looks very different from a map you may look at today of Fall River. And the main feature you'll see is the state line, which is pretty much a diagonal line across the city, what is now the city. The area we're going to focus on is right here. The Quequechan River, there's south of Tupper Pond. And in this map, it's pretty much shown as a thin stream till there's a small pond here, then it drops off. And at the bottom, there were some small coves, which were tidal coves. If you look at Battleship Cove is right here now, so it's pretty much the area that's behind Battleship Cove, underneath the Braga Bridge. That's where the bottom of the river is and was and still is, although it looks very different. Here's a blow up that same area. Division Street, it's marked. It's not there yet, but it's marked. There's South Main Street, North Main Street, and Durfee Wharf. There's pretty much, there wasn't a lot going on, so this pretty much would have all been farmland, as Al mentioned. There's not a lot else going on. A couple small mills on the river, basic needs, grist mills, fulling mills, sawmills. So there's a focus area. So I'm going to start off with this quote by Orrin Fowler, who was a notable preacher in Fall River in the 1840s, around that area. He wrote pretty much the first history of Fall River right about this time. The main feature of Fall River is the combination of the excellent harbor and the water power. It's really no other place in New England. Prior to the advent of reliable steam power, where you had coal come in, you could have steam power anywhere. There really was no other way to power machinery than water power, practically. And then having the harbor right there was, no other, Lowell did not have that. Any location in Maine did not have that. All of the big northern mills, they never had that. They always, first of all, they had canals, and later on they had railroads. So to have that shipping power it really is the difference in why Fall River was able to grow quickly in the beginning, and then even more so once we had coal and steam power. During this period, from 1813 to 19, that should be 1850, I'm sorry. There's pretty much two waves of mills being built, if you will. Again, prior to 1811, there were a few small grist mills, cotton mills, fill mill. There was also a tannery set up by Edmund Chase on Main Street, next to where the post office is now. So that was right on the river. It didn't really use water power, but they needed the water to do the tannery. Then, of course, you have the first wave of mills, 1813, the Fall River Manufactory and the Troy Cotton and Woolen Manufactory. There was a little bit of a break, and then in the 1820s, all the available water power sites on the river pretty much got filled up by 1830. The last, actually the Robeson, 1835 was their last mill, and then the American Printing Company actually, if you go back a couple of slides, they didn't build on the river. They built, which is this Long Pond, which became Crab Pond, which also known as Printworks Pond. So what they ended up doing was they built a canal from the river to this pond. They put a dam there, made it a freshwater mill pond, And that was the original power for the American Printing Company. So. And then you had a second wave of mills. Some of the early mills burned down. Well, they were too small, so they decided to knock them down and rebuild them. Fall River Manufactory rebuilt in 1839. Then you had the fire of 43, which took out part of the Quequechan mill. Newer technology came in, so there was the main two mills on the river were the new Quequechan and the Metacomet, which is the only one still standing of the original mills on the lower part of the river. And also in this period, you had the first two steam-powered mills, which were not on the water power sites. They were Massasoit, 1843, was on the harbor next to where Heritage State Park is now. And then Eddy and Sons was built further upstream. It was the first mill to be built upstream of the dam, but it was solely steam-powered in 1849. Here's a map. It's sort of an overlay map of the area we're going to be discussing. It shows, just to give you a reference, we have the location of Interstate 195, the current location of Government Center and the post office, Hartwell Street, and then the mouth of the river, which is where Heritage State Park is now. So from the top, there was originally 8 falls, 8 naturally occurring falls on the river. And then I'll start from the top. I won't go chronologically. The Troy, Quequechan, Quequechan, Watuppa, Robeson, Fall River, the Anawan, and the Metacomet. And then the ironworks kind of expanded later on, but they were not powered by the river. And then in 1905, the Anawan was knocked down, and American Printing Company built a new mill, mill number 7, which these two are the only mills still standing in that area. So. This graphic shows the relative time period of each of these mills and when they were built. I don't know if you can read the top. It's 1810s to 2010. So Fall River Manufactory, the first mill, was only around for about 20 so years, and so on. So the first Troy, the last Troy mills, the Quequechan mills, the Robeson print mills, and the Anawan mill with the Metacomet at the bottom. So it just kind of gives you a general idea of what we're talking about for the physical buildings as far as when they existed and which ones. These pictures are kind of conjectory as far as what the river might have looked like early on. This one here is actually the waterfall at Fort Barton in Tiverton. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. Similar kind of rock, similar kind of landscape, but early on we had some small mills, so it may have looked like this. Who knows, it may have looked like that. The drops on the river were from 10 feet to 21 feet, so 21 feet is a pretty good size, not a huge waterfall, but it's a pretty decent sized waterfall. The Quequechan River was pretty much the perfect river for industrial development. It was not too big and it was not too small. The Quequechan River did not require the large expense of building dams and power canals typically associated with most rivers in New England. And you think of Lowell, you think of the Blackstone Valley, all these big rivers. There was quite a bit of expense involved in setting these sites up. Whereas Fall River, the river was there. It was just meant, they didn't have to go through all this trouble. The spring-fed Watuppa ponds provided the river a nearly constant flow. It was never known to dry up like some of the streams in the area. For instance, the stream that comes out of Cook Pond, where the 1811 mill was, it has about 50 feet more drop than the Quequechan River, but there's very little flow coming out of that river. Okay, the portion of the stream, as it was called, averaged less than 1 rod wide, which is about 16.5 feet. So if you think of a typical mill, it's not a very big distance to cross, so they can easily build a mill across the river. The early mills were typically built on one side of the river with the wheel set up directly into the riverbed, similar to the way this one is. Later mills, they expanded. They pretty much built right across the river. Some of them had 2 wheel pits. In 1827, the mills got together and formed the Watuppet Reservoir Company, which was represented by each of the companies. And they expanded the dam, they raised it up. So they raised it 2 feet at that time, so the river itself was about 5 feet deep. It's still not very deep, but it was enough to give them the extra bit of power to power the mills. And then again, I'm going to say this again, before the age of reliable steam power, no other location in New England could boast the advantages of reliable water power and a natural harbor. So, some of the early developments. I don't know if any of you attended Jay Lambert's talk a couple of years ago on the 1811 mill. He gave a pretty good overview of the early textile industry developments in England. This is basically a summary of some of them. The flying shuttle, that's a flying shuttle right there, 1733. You had carting machines in 1748 that were invented by two people at the same time. And then 1864, the spinning jenny, that's a spinning jenny. It's basically a spinning wheel with multiple spindles, so it multiplied the amount of work that could be done. It was still a hand-powered machine. And then pretty much you had the first mill in 1771. Arkwright, which is a famous name in textile history, he came up with the water frame in 1769. That's the water frame. And then he also improved on the carting machine. 1779, Crompton came out with the what he called the mule jenny, otherwise known as the spinning mule, which is pretty much a combination of these two machines, and that's it there. So the spinning mule became, as Great Britain advanced, that was their #1 technology pretty much, because they could produce very fine yarns for fine cloths. And then the first power loom was Cartwright, 1784. If you look up most books, that's what it says, but it really wasn't perfected until the early 1800s. So they had it, but it didn't really work very well. And then, of course, after the Revolution, we lost contact with England, and they didn't let us have any of their technology. There was a really big push by the new government of the United States to come up with industry. And the first cotton mill, anybody wouldn't know where the first cotton mill was? Pawtucket, yeah. So, but actually it was a couple of years earlier in Beverly, Massachusetts. Somebody came up with the idea of powering machining with a horse. Didn't work very well. That's why you don't hear much about it. So, but it was very promoted. George Washington visited. This was going to be the next big thing, and didn't really go anywhere. So luckily, Sam Slater came along in 1790 and pretty much saved the day as far as the industry was concerned. Rhode Island got off to an early start, and then by around 1810, which we had the War of 1812, somewhere around there, 1812, 1814, I think it was. It's pretty much slow growth, and then this shows during that period there was we'll call it cotton famine, or the imports from Britain were cut off, so everybody was looking to speculate and get into the cotton business. Rhode Island, you had a lot of mills come in. Most of them were very small, size of a barn, and not many of them made it. Obviously, the 1811 mill was probably one of those. And then as by the 1820s, Massachusetts kind of caught up and passed Rhode Island. So just gives you an idea of what, we had one mill in 1811, 3 mills by 1813, and just kind of give you an idea of what was going on around here. And then, of course, prior to 1814 in Waltham with Paul Moody, and anybody's heard of Francis Cabot Lowell and that group of investors that came over, they came up with the first successful power loom, where they could pretty much come in with raw cotton in one end of the mill, come out with finished cloth in the other end. But prior to that time, the mills around here, the Rhode Island mills, as they call them, Rhode Island system, their finished product was just yarn, just yarn that was put out to various weavers throughout the area. And it was made into cloth on hand looms. And then even with the power loom technology, many of the mills in Rhode Island preferred the old looms because they were better than the new looms. Up until even by 1826, only a third of Rhode Island mills were using power looms. And then, of course, on this side of the pond, as it was, there's a great deal of innovation during this period. And you think about Pawtucket and Lowell, but those were only two places. You had Taunton, you had a lot of little places where you had a few very talented, pretty much blacksmiths. And of course, this region had a long-standing iron-making tradition going back to the colonial period with Saugus Iron Works, and you had Taunton Iron Works, and a lot of little ironworks throughout the area. So you had that technology, the skills involved, but not everybody was bright enough to come up with these machines. One of the first, and you have Slater there, you have Eli Whitney, but David Wilkinson of Pawtucket was pretty much set up Sam Slater's first mill, and his father, Oziel. David Wilkinson is considered the father of the American machine industry. He came up with the first lathe, the first patent for a lathe for making screws, basically. And then Paul Moody is another one of my heroes. First successful power loom. Again, he was pretty much a blacksmith. That was his background. But he just had these self-made men that came up, and then some of them unfortunately died early. Paul Moody, Dave Wilkinson. Then you had, of course, Draper, who later on, his sons kind of grew that business into the Draper Loom Corporation, which later on in the 19th century was the largest loom company in the world. And then in between you have I'm just going to throw this in here, the Roberts self-acting spinning mule, 1825, was kind of a watershed development. As I said, they got off to an early start. They had all the good equipment, and later on, we wanted that. So, but he also had somebody like William Mason, who he came from Connecticut, but he settled in Taunton, and he started making ring spinning frames, and also he came up with his own self-acting mule, which was successful, just as successful as the Roberts. And then ring spinning, if everybody's heard the word spindle, you hear a mill had so many spindles. It's a commonly used term to describe the capacity of a mill. Most people think the bobbin on top is the spindle, but this is an actual spindle, what spins. This is sort of a later 19th century version of it, but they became, in the United States, it became more popular than mule spinning by the mill owners because they took up less space, and they needed less they were less complicated to run, so they could get women and children to run them and pay them less and make more money. So now we talk about Calico Printing. The original print cloths came from India to Europe in around 1630. The region known as Calico, after this Indian city of Calicut. Not Calcutta. Some sources say Calcutta, but they're on two different ends of the country if you look at the map. Carved wooden blocks were used, and the dyes they used were sort of an ancient art of skillfully mixed compounds, and every dyer had their own recipe, and the ones that could produce the most consistent colors were highly sought after. Even once the industry came here for not only calico printing, but silk dyeing and various, of course they had different compounds for different materials, but it was pretty much a, kind of an alchemy before modern chemistry came along and figured it out. And at first, the calicos became popular because, you could produce very intricate patterns that, you had silks, they could weave silks and that type of thing, but it was a lot less expensive. However, the wool and silk makers in England kind of protested, and they pretty much banned cotton and calico importation, which is really why that's how the English cotton, they could make it there, but they just couldn't bring it in. They could bring in cotton, but they couldn't bring in cloth and calico. So they started making their own cloth, and then a few people started making their own print cloth. Let's go through this. The famous toile patterns of Christophe Oberkamp, France, 1760. And then the first first documented cloth printer in the United States was an Englishman, John Hewson. He came to Philadelphia in 1774. This is John Hewson here, and one of his prints. He was very popular with the Washingtons. Martha Washington, came to him. She shopped there all the time, I guess. And then this is an early printing factory, if you will, where it's on tables, and it's all hand printed with blocks, sort of a representation. So the first print shops in Fall River probably look something like this. And then you had roller printing come along as early as 1783 in England, Thomas Bell. And then you had the machine set up by in 1785 in Preston, UK. And the Philadelphia area, as I mentioned, John Hewson, that pretty much became the center of the printing industry early on. And then one of the names that you may recognize is Matthias Baldwin, which, if anybody's heard Baldwin locomotives, one of the largest locomotive makers of the 19th century. He actually got his start making textile machinery. So it's a lot of different skills, but they were very compatible with different industries. Then right here in Providence in 1855, this poor guy engraving the rollers by hand. He had to transfer the pattern from a flat surface onto a roller. Well, they came up with a machine where you could pretty much just trace it, and it would put it onto the roller. It would etch it with acid, so that saved a lot of time. And that's, if you think of the Fall River industry, they took, they took all these technologies, and that's how they became so successful. And this is a roller printing, an early roller printing machine. Here's an example of a printed cotton dress from 1820s. I'm not sure where it was made. I don't think it was Fall River, but I'll just give you an example of the patterns that they used. Here's some 19th century block printers. Fairly big blocks. This guy doesn't look too happy, but it's when you see it, I'll go to the next slide, but it's still practiced today in India. And if you go on YouTube, if you get a chance, it's fascinating to see these hand-carved blocks. And the blocks are only good for so long. So every once in a while they have to make new ones, which you see it, and the guy's just making it like it's nothing. It's just very intricate. And the speed at which they print is just, and you got to line it up perfectly every time. And they just, it's amazing how they do it. It's quite a lot of skill. Here's an overview of the print cloth process, just to give you an idea of some of the terminology. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but seeing that this is Fall River, these are some of the processes that would have been used. More toward the later part, not so much early on, because some of the stuff was still done by hand. The first four would be considered preparatory processes, where they would just take the cotton and prep it for spinning. The second floor would be part of the spinning process. Then you got the weaving process. And then after weaving with printing, you get these little fuzz on the cloth that have to be taken out. That's what singeing is. They used to roll the cloth over hot irons. And they would take off that little fuzz before they bleached it. And then you have printing and packing and a lot of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the water power. There's four main types of water wheels, and they have different efficiencies. You have the pitchback wheel, which according to this diagram is the most efficient. the overshot wheel, breast shot wheel, and undershot wheel. And each one, it all depends on where the water's coming in and where it's going out. And then before, engineering practices became standardized, you had skilled artisans known as wheelwrights or millwrights. They had to choose the right type of wheel for the specific location and determine the diameter or width of the wheel accordingly. And then compared to other industries, textile mills required a lot of power. If you look at that graphic I just showed you, a lot of different processes that, unlike a sawmill or a grist mill where it's one thing going, they needed a lot of power. Press wheels became the most common type used for streams in New England, and they were still quite inefficient. This one shows 50%, some places say 60%. You may ask, like, why don't you just use the breast shot wheel every time? But the problem is the way the water's coming in on this one and the water's going out, if this backs up, it's pretty much fighting itself, so it loses efficiency quite quickly. Same thing with the breast wheel. If you have areas which in Lowell, they used to have one mill used to back up against the other, and they had to monitor that water, otherwise it would just slow it down too much. And then after 1845, you had turbines come in, and gradually, I'm not saying everyone switched at the same time, but they gradually switched to turbines, which were far more efficient. Even with the advent of steam power, a lot of locations, especially rural locations, they preferred water power over steam, because steam, you needed to get the coal up there by train, and you also needed to pay somebody to maintain that steam engine. So in the end, water power, for a small mill in a rural location, was a much cheaper alternative. It was free as long as the water was flowing. Here's the breast wheel at Wilkinson Mill in Pawtucket. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. It's worth seeing if you haven't. This was built around 1980. They put this in. And it was based on some evidence that they found in the wheel pit. The original wheel pit was long gone. But they have a demonstration of how they powered the mill through these gears. And then upstairs, you have these overhead pulleys, which the overhead pulleys with the leather belts, that was an American development by Paul Moody. The mills in England, they like to use gears, which had a lot more resistance, and they wasted a lot of power. So the belting became popular here, and you saw it everywhere up until they came out with electric motors. I found this diagram of an early mill. Would have been similar to some of the early mills in Fall River, where they were built one side of the stream, wheel pit, and you had different, the pulleys going up. One thing you note here is that the looms, at first they put the looms on the top floor, and then they started to shake the mill too much, and they realized, well, it's much better, let's put the looms down here, and let's put the other stuff someplace else, because there's a lot less shaking going on. Now we get a little bit of water turbines. There was a Frenchman, Benoit Fourniron, 1827, came up with the first, what he called a horizontal water turbine. You'll still see them called water wheels, even if you look at different places. But they were very different than a regular water wheel. By 1837, he had a 60 horsepower turbine, and I won't get into the thing, but the blade on it was only a foot in diameter, and it was 80% efficient. It could do a lot more work with a lot less water. And right here in Fall River, George Kilburn, he got the, I don't know if it was a patent or anything like that, but he got the design for Fourniron's turbine, and he started making them right down on Canal Street in the early years. He also made looms, but what you see here is a Fall River turbine. And this is a cutaway of a Fall River turbine, and here are the different wheels inside. Unlike water wheels, turbines operate under pressure, pressurized water, by a penstock, which is basically a pipe. Comes in, water's under pressure, it leaves with very little pressure, so that almost all the energy is used in the turbine. This is the math portion of the presentation. The horsepower, if anybody's ever wondered how the horsepower of a river is calculated, it's nothing more than the weight of the water falling on. If you have a water wheel, it's just the weight of the water. And two things involved: the height it drops and how fast it's coming, or how much water is coming. The different mills, here's a drop of the different mills, starting at the top, going down to the bottom, range from 10 feet to 21 feet, 21.7 for Picasset. Potential horsepower, you're never really going to get that. It's just a theoretical number. With a breast wheel, you can get this number here, and with a turbine, you can get this much here. So with the same amount of water, same amount of drop, if you go from a breast wheel to a turbine, you can get a lot more work done. And that's what the mills eventually did toward the end of the, eventually after the 1850s. Now finally we get into the mills along the river. In March 1813, David Anthony, Dexter Wheeler, Abraham Bowen, and several others, they came up with $40,000 to start the Fall River Manufactory. David Anthony was born in Swansea, in the part that later became Somerset. He moved to Pawtucket in 1808 to work for Samuel Slater. And in 1812, he moved to Rehoboth to work for his cousin Dexter Wheeler. And after 1834, he was known as Deacon Anthony. He retired late 1830s. He had ironwork stock, and he pretty much, that's what he did. Dexter Wheeler, his cousin, he was originally from Rehoboth. He was one of those skilled, jack of all trades, Yankee, whatever you want to call it, ingenuity. He came up with the machinery for some of these mills. In 1809, he opened his own mill in Rehoboth. And it's not the Rehoboth you think today, because if you go to Slater Mill and you look at where the apex used to be in Pawtucket, that side of the river was Rehoboth when he started this mill. So eventually it became Seekonk, and then it became Pawtucket. So he also patented a tide mill wheel in 1811. I don't think it was ever built, but a tide mill, unlike the mills on the river, doesn't use the river. It uses the tide to come in. They hold back the river, hold back the tide, and then they let it go through a wheel. David Anthony served as treasurer until 1839. I just mentioned that. The first mill was known as the Yellow Mill. It was completed October of 1813. And again, it was some of the machinery likely came from Wheeler's Rehoboth Mill. It measured 40 by 60 with 3 stories and a barn roof. So if you think of the average barn back then was 40 by 40 roughly. It wasn't much bigger than a large barn. And the lower story was stone. The upper 2 were made of wood. 1,500 spindles. And the reason why some of the books say why wasn't all stone, they didn't have good derricks back then to lift these stones up. That's the logical answer and the one that makes the most sense. The first yarn was sold in Philadelphia. In 1814, they required a Blair picking machine, which I've never been able to find any information on what a Blair picking machine looks like or what it actually, I know what it did, but there's not too much information on it. After the cotton comes in, it's already been through the gin. There's still a lot of junk in it. They got to pick it out. They used to pick it out by hand. It used to take forever. So this greatly improved that process. Wheeler came up with his own power looms in 1817, and they weren't very good. That's putting it nicely, but they weren't very good. In 1827, they expanded the mill. They put an addition on it. It was known as a Nankeen mill for Azariah and Jarvis Shove. They made Nankeen, which is, I believe, is a pale yellow cloth that was popular at the time. And both of these mills, which pretty much one big mill, was demolished in 1839 for what was known as the White Mill, with 9,000 spindles and 200 looms. And then the 1839 mill, that burned in 1868 and was rebuilt, larger than the second one. And then this mill was acquired by the Picasset in 1905, and it was demolished in 1961. Here's a picture of the third mill the 1868 mill right here. And this is probably around the turn of the century, so it's a much later photo than our time frame, but there are no other photos of the other mills. So here's the Robeson printworks, and this is the Anawan mill, the harbor. And I'm always amazed at how crowded the city was back then. If you look at Pecasset Street, if you're standing at where the Herald News is right now, that's probably about where this picture was taken from. There's just nothing but buildings. It's amazing. Then same March 1813, the same month as the Fall River, a different group with Oliver Chase, Nathan Wheeler, who was Dexter's brother, and Eber Slade. They started Troy Cotton and Woolen Manufactory. It was on the Uppermost Falls. Oliver Chase, he was also born in Swansea, in the part that became Somerset, so a lot of good people came from Swansea, I guess, back in the day. He also worked for Slater in Pawtucket, and he was a carpenter and a millwright. He built his own mill in Swansea on the Lees River in 1806. So 1806 to 1813, so roughly 7 years later, he moved to Fall River. The first mill, slightly larger than the Fall River Manufactory. It was completed in September of 1813, but did not open until 1814. Probably because they didn't have the machinery ready. That's my only guess. Why'd they wait 6 months? I don't know. Slightly larger than the Fall River, 2,000 spindles. And then pretty much as soon as these mills were built, they were built during the War of 1812. The war ended, British goods came back in, prices dropped, and they had a struggle for quite a while. Chase, he remained with the Troy until 1822, when he went over to the Pecasset to accept a similar position. Similar to the Fall River, they sold the cloth far and wide throughout New England. They were a little later in power weaving, 1820. And then they built another addition known as the Little Mill, 1821. The Troy was built on the site of a sawmill. If you remember that map, there was a little pond right where City Hall is right now. That's pretty much, there was a sawmill there. The first Troy mill burned in 1821 rather, and it wasn't rebuilt until 1823. And then later on they added an addition, 1843. This was expanded in 1853, same addition. 1860, the rebuilt Troy mill was built, was removed, and a new mill was built. The thing about the Troy, they call themselves the Cotton and Woolen Manufactory, and they never really got around to making woolens, but they kept the name, and that's you see that a lot in Fall River with a lot of different companies. The American Linen Company started, and they did cotton after, but they never changed the name because I guess why bother? By 1862, they had over 38,000 spindles. More so, they also had steam supplemental because they were the top mill on the river, and when the river dried up in the summertime, they had the most to lose because they didn't have that drop. So they had to rely on steam power more than the other mills. Here's the Troy. The old police station's right here. Post office back here somewhere. So this is Troy Street. This is what used to be Pleasant Street. Now Pleasant Street starts over here. So just to give you an idea of where it was. Here's the 1843, 1853 mill. I'm not sure which. I gotta imagine it was started here and expanded this way, and then the 1868, 1862 mill rather, was on this side. The third mill on the river was the Pecasset in 1821. It was established by Samuel Rodman and a group of New Bedford investors. He had made his money in whaling, and I guess he looked at textiles as a good opportunity. They built it. If you know where Gramada Plaza is now, across from Government Center, that was the first mill. It was more into the street than the later mill was. And then for the first 2 decades, they pretty much just leased space. They didn't make their own cloth or did anything. They just pretty much leased space to other manufacturers. Again, Oliver Chase, he moved over to the Picasset 1822. The first mill completed 1822, 40 by 100, so it's about the size of the Troy, the first Troy. And then it had the most power on the Quequechan with almost 22 feet of drop. And then they built 2 more mills, the Picasset did. They had 3 of the 8 falls occupied, so they had Machine Company, Harris, Hawes and Company. They moved down from Waltham after the Troy mill burned, and there's this funny story how Oliver Chase and his buddy were going up to Waltham to look for these guys, and these guys were coming down, and they met in Taunton. Somehow somebody told them they were looking for each other, and that's how the story goes, but I don't know if it really happened that way. 1825, the Satinet mill was erected. Satinet is a mixture of woolen and cotton yarn, which is why the Troy was called Cotton and Woolen Manufactory, but Satinet really didn't last that long, kind of died out after a while. And then the second mill was the Quequechan mill, 1826, further downstream. And then the Watuppa mill was built a year later, 2 falls down from the original mill. And then the bridge and fulling mills were destroyed in the fire of 1843. And then in 1846, they knocked down the Satinet mill to build the new Picasset, which was quite a bit larger than the first mill. If you look at the numbers, 75 and 40. So here's a map of, it's right around the time of the Great Fire, 1843. The map is upside down, if you will. You know, north is going this way. So if you look at government centers right here, this is North Main Street, South Main Street. This is what I was saying. The first mill was further upstream, and then after it burnt down, they rebuilt, but they put the granite block here, and then the new mills were further downstream. So they didn't rebuild in the same place. It would have been a very it's a narrow street to begin with. If you look at the pictures of the trolleys and everything going through, that would have been impossible like that to get through. The next company was the Fall River Iron Works, 1821. Of course, we had Richard Borden, Bradford Durfee, which is probably 2 of the most famous names in Fall River. Also included were Holder Borden, David Anthony, William Valentine, and Joseph Butler. They were on the lowest of the 8 falls, where the Metacommon is now. I just said that. They initially produced iron bars and hoops and nails. The hoops for barrels, they sold a lot to the New Bedford whaling industry. And the nails, they pretty much sold the nails all over the place. They were one of the, they didn't invent the nail machine, but they made the most of it. And they had the connections to sell. I mean, they knew how to sell stuff early on. And then, they some say they struggled for a while, but by a couple of years down the road, they started building other mills. They used the profits from the ironworks to build the Anawan mill in 1825 and the print works in 1834. 1840, they built a huge new rolling mill on the waterfront. It was one of the largest in New England, and also a new nail mill on the waterfront. By this time, they were pretty big. They were probably one of the largest in New England. Nails, hoops, the same things going on in castings. Pig iron mostly came from Sweden and Russia. People hear bog iron. That was pretty much depleted by around 1800. A lot of the early ironworks around here used bog iron, but it wasn't a very good iron ore to begin with, but they had much better sources overseas. The first rolling mill was destroyed just prior to the Great Fire, which was in July 1843. This was in June of that same year. It was rebuilt in just 6 weeks. and then they added the foundry, which just, you can't do anything in 6 weeks these days, I guess. And then, unfortunately, right after the Great Fire in July, Bradford Durfee died, July 23rd, so that's the same month. He was 56, I believe, 50, do my math. He's in his 50s. Then the ironworks, pretty much Richard Borden took over after Durfee died. And then the 1840s, after the fire, they grew pretty big. The original $18,000 investment had grown to $960,000, which is about $23 million in today's money. It was quite something. They used the profits to fund railroads, the gas works. They built the Metacomet Mill, banks, steamships. Of course, the Fall River Line got its start through them. And they even bought their own coal mine in Maryland. So they pretty much had everything covered. You know, whatever they needed, they just bought it. Here's some of the power. Like I said, they say it was one water wheel. Here's Printworks Pond, which was a crab pond, same thing, powered by a canal from the river. So not a lot of power. I can't imagine there being much power in that pond. And it burned again in 1858 and was rebuilt. And by the 1870s, they had 600 people working. There's some of the equipment. And unfortunately, just a few years later, we had the advent of cheap steel from mostly Pennsylvania and that area there. So they couldn't compete. And by the 1870s was a long depression anyway, so they pretty much had to fold by the end of the decade. And then, of course, the Ironworks name lived on as part of the American Printing Company. Here's a picture of a 19th century ironworks, the inside. If you hear the term puddling furnace, we had 5 double and 2 single puddling furnaces. What they did was they took the pig iron that came in from overseas, and they had to refine it into raw iron. They had to get all the carbon out, and they didn't have chemists. They didn't have all this technology. The puddler, also known as a rattler, it was really an art form, as they could feel when it was ready, and they knew when to take it out. Here's a rolling mill. Shows some of the hot bars, different shapes, different sizes. They would start with a big ball, and they would just hammer it down until they got what they wanted. In 1825, they built the Anawan Mill, entirely owned by the Ironworks in its earlier years. It was always the smallest mill on the river, the smallest mill in the city. Okay, and in 1888, it was struck by lightning, and it was soon rebuilt with a flat roof. I just said that. And it was demolished again in 1905 for the American Printing Company, mill number 7. And there's a remnant of the penstock that still exists. If you look at this picture here, this is mill number 7. It's the wow mill, people call it. There's that penstock. It's still there, a piece of it. And then next we have the Robeson Printworks. Andrew Robeson was born in Philadelphia. His father lived there. His father operated flour mills, and he gained experience as a millwright and learned the art of print cloth making. He moved to New Bedford. He married Samuel Rodman's daughter, 1817, and then 1824 he set up in the Quequechan, the bridge mill. Established the first print works in Fall River, so he could be considered the father of the print works in Fall River. He became known for his indigo blueprints. This is an indigo print. I don't think it's his, but it gives you an idea of what we're talking about. In 1826, the Fourth Falls was just downstream of the Quequechan, the Watuppa mill. He was pretty much the last empty site on the river. He added a second building and then a third building. I'll show you in a minute. He hired builders from Pennsylvania, and we don't have any colored pictures of the mill, but they say it was a blue, sort of a blue stone. And first print cloths, if you hear the term 64 by 64, that became the standard. There was 64 threads per inch later on in the century. That's what they used, but the early cloths were much coarser. They couldn't get that fine yarn. First printing machine, 1827. Copper rollers, 1832. Third mill, his last mill, 1836. And then he hung on to block printing until 1841. And then they just couldn't compete with the American print works and the Bay State. So they reorganized 1848. But by 1864, they pretty much gave up cloth printing. They were just making the cloth. That's the only thing they could do. And they reorganized as the Quequechan Manufacturing Company. Not to be confused with the first Quequechan mill from the Picasso, that was earlier. And they were demolished in 1960s for pretty much where Milken Boulevard is now. So here's the #1 mill. Here's the river here. This is photos after the fire. You can see the ruins of the Picasso mills, 1928. Mill #2, mill #3. This building was never part of that. It was added later, but you see the sign Masco Mops. That was, by then it was Massasoit Manufacturing Company. They made mops out of cotton waste. And there's another shot of the Fall River what they call the White Mill. Here's I think it's a label. I got this from Jay Lambert's collection. He had it blown up, so I can't tell if it was a sign or whatever it was, but I think it's from the late 1850s. This is the Metropolis, which was, if you look it up, it came out in 1855. They had already changed the name to Fall River Printworks by then, but I guess they kept the brand name. Here's the ironworks on the waterfront. There's the steamboat lines, and this is the new Picasso with the tower. And some of these churches, I don't know if we ever had churches that looked like that, but some artistic license in there. And of course, we got to mention Holder Borden, which we have no pictures of him, but he was the early, pretty much he founded the Printworks 1834, and I'll tell you in a minute, but he was the son of George and Phoebe Borden, and who was the eldest sister of Richard and Jefferson Borden. He was a nephew of Richard and nephew of Jefferson. Jefferson was younger than him, but he was his uncle. So this is how things were back then. He became stepson of Bradford Durfee after Phoebe married Bradford Durfee. He worked for David Anthony as a teenager in the Fall River Mill. He moved to Pawtucket, worked for the Wilkinsons, and he later got a job as the agent for the Blackstone Company, which I think at that time was one of the largest mills in Rhode Island. So he's a young man, he's very ambitious. They gave him a lot of responsibility. He had connections with the Valentines, the Butlers, Valentine Street right here. And those were Providence people, Butler Hospital, Providence people, those type, that family. But the ironworks ended up building a building in Providence, which is still there. So there's a lot of connection going back and forth between two cities. And again, he was the first person in what was still Troy to really make money, as I said. He established the Massasoit Mill in 1826 with Brown and Ives. That was strictly to make print cloth to feed the printworks. He bought the Tiverton Printworks in 1833. A year later, he opened the American Printworks. He established it. It opened in 1835. As I mentioned, with Crab Pond, it was powered by the river, and it was supplemented by steam. And the Printworks was still a division of the Ironworks until 1857. So when you say Printworks, Ironworks, it's It's really the same thing. He died, unfortunately, age 38 without a will. He left his fortune, mostly ironworks stocks, to his mother. He passed away. His estate passed to Bradford in a few years after Phoebe died. But we know that story. Eventually became the money that gave us BMC Durfee High School. I always say is if he had lived longer, it might be called Holder Borden High School. There's a quote I found from the New York Times, and it's just kind of epitomizes that whole connection of Durfees and Bordens, but you can read it. Can you read it? Just, and then after Holder's death, Jefferson took over the print works, 1837. There's a label of the early print works prior to 1860s or so. This print is from 1876. It was from the centennial. They had like a centennial collection. But we don't have. I don't know if we have anything earlier, but that's the only thing I could find that was actually one of their prints from early on. They expanded in 1840. By 1854, there's the number of 6 printing machines. They purchased the Bay State Print Works, which was then still in Tiverton. It was called the Tiverton Print Works. They renamed it. It was the Globe Print Works. They renamed it the Bay State Print Works. And they were rebuilding the main plant in 1867, and it was just about ready when it burnt down. So it wasn't insured yet, and they had to rebuild it all over again. 1869. He continued as agent until 1870. The agent pretty much was like the chief guy that ran everything. Nowadays they probably call it, COO or something like that, Chief Operating Officer or something like that. And by then it had become the largest print cloth company in the U.S. It was reorganized in 1880. It was after the ironworks fell apart. They just changed the name, reorganized it. And again, that's a whole nother, we could do a whole lecture on the American Printing Company, but it's way beyond the scope of this. And then now we'll talk about some of the machine industry in Fall River. In 1841, the first Roberts self-acting mule was installed at the Anawan Mill. And I mentioned back in 1825, Richard Roberts came up with the patent in the UK. And we had nothing like it, nothing that really could compete with it. So 1838, William Duval and Bradford Durfee went over to England. They did a tour, looking at different mills, looking at different equipment. They tried to get the machine exported, but they were denied. And then you read various accounts of this, but it basically had been chopped up into thousands of pieces. It came from France, and they got it in New York 1840, and they had to put it back together. And then he actually, after Bill Duval was one of those technical guys, he was a mechanic, so I guess he figured it out. He actually applied for the patent on behalf of Richard Roberts, 1841. This is the actual patent drawing, so you can look up the patent and see it in there. It doesn't mention Will Duval anywhere, though, in the patent. It's interesting. And then here's his company. It was originally, I mentioned Harris and Hawes. They came in 1823. They came down from Waltham. The names changed, Hawes, Duval, Marvel, and then it was later Marvel and Duval. So they eventually got absorbed by the Ironworks, that company. And then also Bill Mason in Taunton, he came up with his own spinning mule right around the same time as Duval did. So they competed for a number of years, and then, like all technology, things change. So they're only good for so long, and somebody else comes along with something better. A little bit about the workforce. These mills didn't run themselves. Some of the early production, as Al mentioned, was home. It was a home cottage industry. It was traditionally a task for women and children if you made yarn, made cloth. Once the first mills arrived, it was sort of a natural transition to get them in, working the machinery. Like other mills in the region, the mill owners went around and recruited single women from mostly farms in rural parts of New England, up in Vermont and all places like that. And it's difficult to think about because we always say, it was long, hard hours, they didn't get paid and this and that, but you just got to put yourself in that time frame. And back then, a lot of the farms, they had 20 kids or whatever, and there was really no, not too much opportunity in a little town in Vermont. So they kind of, I don't know if they wooed them in or something like that with a paycheck and you can make money and this and that thing. But the thing you think about is that a lot of them went back and forth between the mills, and not just Fall River. They moved around to different mills, and then they went back in the winter or whatever time of year. It was kind of a transient lifestyle for them. Not always, but in general. And then with the advent of printing, they got skilled workers from England and Scotland. If you look at the establishment of the Episcopal Church, and you try to figure out when these groups came, you look at when the church was established, because it generally gives you an idea of when they came in. 1834, 1836. The mule spinners came during the 1840s, and once we were building mules, we needed somebody to run them that knew what they were doing. So they came over traditionally from Britain, and then it was predominantly a male occupation. There's a mule spinning machine there. There's a loom, power loom, and then the famous mill girls from Lowell. And then the Irish came. They came in small numbers in the 1820s, and then later on, the 1840s is when it really came in. Even before the famine, which was 48, they came early on in the 40s. St. Mary's was established 1852. And then later on, you have other groups, the French Canadians, 1862. And then after 1870, everybody came. The floodgates opened, and you had everybody coming. 1840, Fall River had a population about 6,000. 32,000 spindles, 1,000 looms, and 8 mills. Is the production. We made about 6,000 yards of cloth, but we printed 16,000. So we had to get about 10 million, 10 million yards came from elsewhere, and mostly the mills of Rhode Island. Then we had 3 banks, and then we also had 5 whale ships registered. Nothing compared to New Bedford, but I guess they decided they couldn't sit by and watch. So. And here's a picture of Fall River, 1840. Kind of reminds me of Warren or Bristol. If you go down, there's a street in Warren where there's a church like that, and kind of these old houses. And of course, the big event during this time frame was the fire of 1843. Began in the corner of Borden and South Main Street through the thoughtless mischief of a few Sabbath-breaking boys. They were playing with a cannon, and it lit up some sawdust. And it burned 20 acres. The fire extended all the way to Franklin Street in the north. Pretty much wiped out the whole, what was known as the town back then, 196 buildings. The only 2 mills were burnt. It was the bridge mill and the carding factory. I gotta look that up because before I said the fulling mill. I don't know if the fulling mill survived or not, but the tannery went. And we also lost the Athenaeum, and we had the skeleton and armor, which Bob mentioned last week, so kind of tied in. And about $12 million in today's money worth of losses. And of course, we had the motto, "We'll try," which is the Fall River motto to this day. It came out of that fire, so. And this is, trying to figure out, I thought this was the bridge mill, and maybe that was the Athenaeum, but this is South Main Street looking north. So it's real hard to make anything out. But. And then after the fire, you had sort of the second wave of mill building in the 1840s. The Picasset, 1843, they knocked down the Satinet mill, which survived the fire. They built what they call the new Picasset. It was much wider than any of the other mills, and it was the first of the so-called wide mills. 18,000 spindles, 360 looms, had the greatest water power on the stream. And they also built, the Quequechan built the granite block after the fire too. Oh, I'll go back a second. Here's the original mill, the 1846 mill. This part here, around 1880, they added these two. This is mill number 2, mill number 3. This is where the fire started in 1928. Kind of took everything out. 1847, the ironworks, they built the Metacomet mill, 1846 to 1847. It was based on plans brought from Bolton, England, by Durfee and Duval during their trip in 1838. It was the first mill in Fall River to have cast iron posts and connectors. Probably, I gotta imagine they were made at the ironworks. I mean, why would you go out and get them someplace else? 21,000 looms, 300 workers. And even, like I said, even in 1847, it was built with 2 breast wheels. So they were still using the old technology, supplemented by a small steam engine. And later on, the turbines replaced the breast wheels. We don't know where they were made. Maybe they were made across the street at Kilburn's. 1904 through 6, it was expanded. It became the mill number 6 of the American Printing Company. If you look now, it's got a flat roof. There's a big addition here. The tower doesn't really look like that anymore. And it's still there, the oldest remaining mill in Fall River. Oh, go back a second. Talking about the penstock, here it is. And it's amazing when you go out there, it looks like these windows look like they've been there the whole time, but they really did a nice job of matching it when they did it. Talk a little bit about steam engines. The first steam engines were brought from England before the Revolution. 1801, Oliver Evans of Philadelphia, he develops a high-pressure steam engine. And then he builds the first Woolen mill in Connecticut to be powered by a steam engine in 1811. 1827, Samuel Slater built a steam mill in Providence on the waterfront. It wasn't very successful, which is why you don't hear too much about it. In 1830s, you see a large increase in number of steam engine manufacturers with the advent of steamships and locomotives. By 1835, you had 2 steam mills in Newport. There's the Perry Mill, which is still there. It's all shops. This is Oliver Evans' first engine. And then 1836, you had a mill in Bristol, which is still there. It's been converted into apartments. 1838, Providence had 23 engines. Boston, 114. Philadelphia, 174. So you see mostly coastal locations that had these. It was just easier and quicker and cheaper to ship coal. Charles James, he was a promoter, I think he was from Newport originally, but he came up with the idea of all these coastal New England towns, these historic seaports such as Salem, Newburyport, and Portsmouth. And he built mills. He got investors together and built steam mills in all these places. Of course, 1849, George Corliss of Providence, he patented a new valve gear, which this is one of the Corliss engines. This is the cylinder, and the valve gears are just the little pieces here. But that was a revolutionary invention that the engines operated a lot more efficiently and used a lot less coal than the earlier ones. His company started in 1856. 30% more efficient than previous engines. And then they finally made steam technology competitive with water power so that you had sites that were miles inland. They could finally compete with the coastal locations. And then, of course, you had boiler technology, which also improved later on in the 19th century. And then we had two steam mills prior to 1850. The Massasoit Mill, which was on the waterfront in 1843. It was initially built as a double mill with a 225 horsepower engine. Nathan Durfee, it was known as a doctor's mill. He was a doctor, but I know he gave up doctoring for textiles. And then one of the mills burned in 1875 was not rebuilt. The site was later acquired by Massasoit Manufacturing Company. Remember, they also acquired Robeson, so Massasoit actually they started here because that's how they got their name, but then they took the Robeson later. And then it's right where Heritage State Park Boathouse is now. Go back a second. I found this picture, and it's around 1867. I believe that's one of the early mills that burnt. And the other one probably would have been just off this screen here. You can see the ironwork. I had to blow it up to get it in there, but the ironworks, printworks is over here. It was a small mill. It wasn't very big at all. And then 1849, you had Jesse Eddy. He built the first steam-powered mill above the dam on the Quequechan River. He had previously operated the Satinet Mill and the Picasset Mill. Well, that's not right. It's a Satinet Mill owned by the Picasset Mill Company with his brother John. Satinet, as I mentioned before, is cotton warp and wool filling, or weft. Pretty much he gave up that in 1843 and switched to cashmere, which is also a wool production. After the lease expired in 1845, they built the Eagle Mill in Tiverton. Anybody knows what Eagleville Road is in Tiverton? There used to be a small pond there, and that's where the mill was. But it burnt down, and they just gave it up. And he partnered with Joseph Durfee to build a new mill, but unfortunately Durfee died before the mill was completed, 1849. That's when he got together with his sons. It was a much smaller engine, 60 horsepower compared to the Massasoit. And then after his death, after Eddie died, his sons renamed it the Wamsutta Steam Woolen Mill. Later on, it was owned by the American Woolen Company, which, if anybody's ever been to Lawrence, half the town is American Woolen. Big company up there. But it was sold to, again, Massasoit. So Massasoit took all these three little mills. But they took cotton waste, which with all the mills, we had 100 mills in the city, over 100 mills, and they would sweep the floors, and then that waste, they would make mops, make clotheslines, twine, different things like that. This mill was demolished in the 1960s for the highway. And then now we come to 1850. Fall River had a population of 11,000 or so. This map is a little late. I think it's 1852, 1853, but it shows the boundary still there. And it also shows a Fall River, Rhode Island. 1852, let me see if they say this. Straddle the state line, 1852, Fall River, Rhode Island split from the rest of Tiverton. So there were two Fall Rivers for about 10 years. There was also two Pawtuckets for a while. There was a Pawtucket, Massachusetts, Pawtucket, Rhode Island. 1854, we become the 11th city in the state. And then give you an idea of how big we were, how small we were, depending on which way you look at it. New Bedford was still bigger than us, and Lowell had got off to an early start. They had much more, and they had about 10 times more power and 10 times more people, and well, 3 times more people, but they had a lot more going on until later on when we got the steam going, we caught up to them. All right, so we get a conclusion. Again, the suitable location, natural advantages of Fall River made it prime for industrial development during the first half of the 19th century. It also benefited from the ambition of a few local individuals and the business connections they made with others in the area. By mid-century, we're talking 1850s or so, they had firmly established an economic and technological base, which a lot of people don't talk about it. It's like, you had all these mills going. They didn't run themselves. You had people that knew how to do this stuff. And then before the steam power, coal could be delivered directly to the harbor, less expense than Lowell, for instance. We always compare to Lowell because we were always chasing them, and then once we passed them, we wanted to stay ahead of them. So, and then similarly to coal, you had raw cotton coming in and finished cloth going out. And then of course, later on, you had a flood of cheap immigrant labor that replaced the Yankee mill girls. And then 1862, we got land swap with Rhode Island. We got Fall River, Rhode Island. Opened up a large area. We got all these new mills going. We need some place to put them. So we got the Flint, we got the South End, we got the whole area. And it's pretty much, we were in the right place at the right time, if you will. But they took the most, the people that lived here, the mill owners, the workers, everybody, they took advantage of it. They made the most of it. By 1870, this is just astounding, and if there's ever another talk, you can get into this period, but between 1859, which is when the Union Mill was established, 1874, we had 25 new corporations and 47 new mills in just that short time frame, which is unbelievable. And again, Lowell, 1868, we passed them up with the number of spindles. We had 508,068, and just 4 years later, we had over 1 million, so it's absolutely ridiculous. Manchester, America, and the city of Hills, Mills, and Pork Pies. So, and then I just want to finish with this. Some people may have seen this already. I wrote a book on, it's pretty much a guide to all the mills in Fall River, every one of them that was ever built, and where they were located and all that. It's available at the Fall River Historical Society gift shop and also on lulu.com. That's it. Is there any questions? This is not the air conditioning.